On Sunday, this coming Sunday, the 27th of February, we are going to be looking at Deuteronomy chapter 7. And this chapter raises some inspiring and some challenging issues and also some difficult questions. And it raises one difficult question in particular. Deuteronomy chapter 7 verse 2 says, "And when the Lord your God has delivered them over to you and you have defeated them, then you must destroy them totally. Make no treaty with them and show them no mercy." As the people enter the land, they are told to get rid of everyone in the land. Now, that same idea has already come up in chapter 2 and will again come up in chapter 12 and 13 and chapter 20 of Deuteronomy. What do we make of these very uncomfortable words? And how do we understand them whilst in the same breath claiming that God is true when he reveals himself to us as being a God of love? Well, rather than tackle all of this question on Sunday, I thought it was probably better to address some of these questions in a video, and then I can briefly make reference to it during the sermon on Sunday. I don't want to absorb too much time on Sunday with it because though it's really, really important, it's not particularly edifying. And it won't in and of itself leave us sort of encouraged to live for Jesus for another week, that argument in and of itself. So this video is looking particularly at the more thorny moral questions as to why God would do this. The sermon itself on Sunday will deal with what God intends to achieve in this and for his people by commanding such definitive action. It's clear God takes sin and purity and the worship of his people extremely seriously, and that any threat to that is to be dealt with ruthlessly. But more of that in the sermon. This video is particularly about that thorny question. And it's important to tackle it. It's important to tackle these challenging ethical questions because to avoid them and not explain them is choosing to select, if you like, the issues that we're prepared to teach from the Bible. Of course, the Bible is God's word. It has an authority because it is true. And also, this question is very much the kind of question that our world is asking. I mentioned a couple of weeks ago about Richard Dawkins, who accused the God of the Old Testament as being, quote, "a vindictive, bloodthirsty ethnic cleanser, a racist, infanticidal, genocidal, megalomaniacal, capriciously malevolent bully." Of course, in our day and age, when the Apostle Peter says to us in 1 Peter, "Always be prepared to give an answer to everyone who asks you to give the reason for the hope that you have, but do this with gentleness and respect." In our day and age, it is to accusations like this one from Richard Dawkins that we need to respond. And it's not just him. Lots of people say something similar. Or maybe even simply that we know where to go to, or that there is somewhere to go to when we want to tackle a question like that. Now, certainly I'm unashamedly looking to well thought through teachers, scholars and theologians that I know of around when I come to this. There's particularly a guy called Peter Williams who is based in Cambridge at Tyndale House, who has done some stuff on this, which has been very, very helpful. And much of what I'm saying really is simply a reshaping of what he has said. So I'm not claiming to have any original ideas here. I'm using his stuff, which is very, very helpful. Of course, the alternative is that we think, or we begin to say, that this stuff in the Old Testament isn't really relevant to today at all in our more civilized, complex, developed and technological world. The trouble is that simply won't do. Both because of the misplaced arrogance about how civilized we are in comparison to previous generations, but also by claiming that some of the Bible is somehow no longer true and is to be interpreted in a different, more developed way in the 21st century. You know, if we go down that line, who is to stop us reinterpreting vast portions of the Bible, the bits that we get to pick and choose because they don't fit with where we're thinking? You know, the gospel, the message of Jesus, the need for salvation. It's a very dangerous slippery slope, and one that once you've started the descent, it's very difficult to find a foothold or a handhold to drag yourself back up again, of going to a view of the Bible, which really means we just chuck it out the window. And that's not appropriate for us at all. How can we know anything if God has not spoken? And so, with a very deliberate and unashamed nod to Peter Williams in Cambridge and others like him, where do we begin? Well, firstly, the first thing we need to be clear about is that we are reading our Bibles right. Now, we've already just said that it is tempting to cut corners on this issue in particular, and kind of consign this chapter and other bits of the Bible to a different, past, out-of-date time. But that is too easy, and it is too damaging and dangerous. Throughout Exodus, throughout Leviticus, throughout Numbers and Deuteronomy, as we're seeing, and right through actually into the book of Joshua, we see a recurrent phrase, and the phrase is something being devoted to destruction. That phrase is used a lot, and it denotes a kind of ritual setting apart or setting aside something for God out of devotion to Him because of His holiness. Now, that might be an individual person who has sinned. It might be a land. It might be a people, or might be some property. And this herem, which is what the devoted to destruction word is a huge theme. And it's far more of a subject than we can cope with in this video. A very significant thing, but I wanted to mention that. For example, Exodus chapter 22, verse 20, we're told that whoever sacrifices to any god other than the Lord alone shall be devoted to destruction. That's that phrase. In Deuteronomy, as we've seen in our chapters, chapter 2 verse 34, chapter 3 verse 6, when Israel faced Sihon and Og, the Israelites devoted to destruction every city, men, women and children. And it says, we left no survivors. Now that language is stark, is blunt, is complete. And likewise here in chapter 7, as the people are instructed on entering the land, they are told, and when the Lord gives them over to you and you defeat them, then you must devote them to complete destruction. Chapter 13 verse 15, chapter 20 verse 17 are similar. The book of Joshua is a book that records the actual conquering of the land, and therefore there's plenty of references to herem in the book of Joshua. Anyone who wants to take their faith and their Bible seriously, who wants to live and read God's word with integrity, needs to look at this difficult question long and hard. And we also see here in chapter 7 other instructions that add to our understanding of what this command from the Lord meant. Now, immediately after the instruction to destroy them completely, the people are told not to make a covenant with them, or make no treaty with them, or do not intermarry with them. Well, that's interesting, isn't it? Because it's a seeming contradiction here. You know, you can't make a treaty or covenant with or not marry people you've destroyed. Now, of course, it is quite possible that this is really simply an acknowledgement, because the Lord knows that the people didn't actually do what God asked them. And the book of Joshua, time and time again, makes that clear when they didn't rid the land of the people. There are other people who wonder whether this is actually intended as a broadening of our understanding of destroy, from just the literal word destroy everything, with some even suggesting that what's happening here is it's an instruction to destroy the cities with all men, women and children in them, as a kind of summary statement of how ruthless they are to be in battle, perhaps when facing the cities that actually would have been war camps. Wipe out the war camps. Now that to me seems a little too easy, but regardless, it's right that we read our Bibles properly. And the reason these easy answers are tempting for us is partly because of the culture we live in. And this is the second thing that we need to acknowledge. Because many of the TV programs or the movies that we watch, if you've ever noticed or you've ever spotted, sometimes they use a colour filter in the background or on the lens that sets a tone or a scene or a feel. As you watch the program, as you live in it, if you like, you don't see that it's a blue filter that kind of gives it a kind of cold, clinical feel, or an orange filter that makes everything feel warm and glowing. Now, our culture has a load of filters through which we see our world. For example, we expect true things to be simple. We want a simple yes or a no answer. For example, we want a yes or no answer from our politicians or leaders that we can then make a judgment of their guilt or innocence against. And we, often mediated by the journalists we listen to, we don't have time for long answers of explanation. We just want a simple yes or no. The problem is, difficult questions require difficult answers. And that takes time and an unpicking of the issues. And the accusation that God advocates genocide and violence is a very thorny, difficult question. And so the answer will itself be difficult, partly because we need to unpick the question before we answer it. You know, which God? What are you saying God is like? What is genocide? How do we define it? What do we mean by that? What are our assumptions behind it? The God spoken of in Deuteronomy is not one amongst many gods. He is the creator of all things. Without him, as revealed in the Bible, there would be no people, no earth, no life, no death. He makes life, and therefore, by definition, he makes the rules about life. We can't, from outside the biblical story, apply an arbitrary requirement about the wrongness of ever taking life to the God of the Bible, without whom we couldn't have life unless he has made that requirement. So in short, murder is surely the unauthorized taking of innocent life, for the sake of argument. But even in our culture, there are still occasions when even the taking of innocent life isn't, even in our day, viewed as murder. Peter Williams speaks of the pilots of 2 US jets who were charged with bringing down one of the 9/11 planes that was heading towards a highly populated US target. Now, the pilots didn't in the end need to carry out their plan to do that, but they had intended on flying their jets simultaneously into the front and the back of the plane over an unpopulated area. Now, if they had done, they would have been thought of as heroes. They wanted to save lives, but in order to do that, they were required to take innocent life, those others on the aeroplane. Now, of course, these are extreme situations, but the point is clear. There are difficult questions requiring difficult answers that mean there just might be occasions when the deliberate taking of innocent life is not in and of itself wrong. And actually, one book I've got, the IVP Dictionary of the Old Testament, in that book, scholars have shown that Israel was only ever once engaged in strictly offensive warfare as opposed to defensive. And on that occasion, Israel lost because they were being disobedient to God, who had told them not to attack. That's the occasion before they first went into the land that we thought about a number of weeks ago. When we look across all the instructions to go in and destroy, throughout the rest of Exodus through to Joshua, there is always a defensive reason or an issue of national security, whether directly or indirectly, that leads to the instruction. Something putting the security of God's covenant people at great risk. So far we have thought about the ways that we know what is right and wrong and how our culture shapes the way that we see or we know those things. Now, as we consider the accusations against God, it's therefore important we see the filters that shape these questions. But it's also right that we see God clearly. Now, we've already said God is the giver of life. That means he is, if you like, the owner of life. Now, any judgment of how God acts needs to be understood in that light. We shouldn't take the life of someone because somebody else tells us to. However, there are occasions when a relevant authority gives permission or an instruction to do something that changes, if you like, a moral category. And because God is the owner of life, he is the only one who could ever authorize the taking of life. Indeed, the entire Bible's understanding of life is that God is sovereign over it. When it starts, how it is experienced, when and how it ends. And in a sense, what we're describing, this question, is just a very specific and challenging example of that. If genocide is mass murder, and murder is the unauthorized taking of life, God can't, by that definition, be genocidal, because he is the only one able to authorize when life ends. But not only that, the God of the Bible, the God that we read of in the Old Testament, always has future foreknowledge. And that changes things. He knows what is going to happen in the future. Knowing the future might change what we do now in potentially surprising ways. For example, gambling. If we had foreknowledge, gambling would no longer be gambling, would it? Because you'd know beforehand what was going to happen. It might be unkind to other people, but it wouldn't be gambling because you'd know what was going to happen. Judging something as being right or wrong, all the risks of gambling have gone if you've got foreknowledge. Judging whether something is right or wrong by its consequences, whether you win or not, is difficult for us. Because we can never be sure of what will happen when we do something. Not really, but God can. God has the authority to do what he wants, and he also knows the outcome. Now, if God were not consistently revealed in the Bible as kind and loving and compassionate, this could be a very terrifying truth. But consistently through the Old Testament and the New Testaments, and of course most significantly in the giving of Jesus himself, we see God as being loving, kind, benevolent, consistently compassionate, and passionate about what is right and wrong. We see him as being good and pure and perfect and holy. So let's put the bricks together. God has the authority to do what he wants. He made life. God knows the outcome of what he will do and always does what is loving and good. Now that should shape the way we feel about our answers to the challenge of whether God has acted ethically or not. And perhaps when we look at the story, we should see that anyway. You see, people have a tendency to read the story of the Exodus from Egypt and then the wandering around in the wilderness and then the conquest of Canaan. People have a tendency of reading that without God. But of course, anyone reading that story who is looking in critically, anyone reading that story with a sense of integrity has to, for the sake of the story, whether they personally believe it or not, read the story of though the God of the Bible is real, because the story is dependent upon him. We can't make a judgment against the morality of devoting a land to destruction as though the God requesting it is not real and so hasn't carried out all the miracles that have led to that point, isn't the God who created and owns life and is therefore authorized to sovereignly rule over it, who knows the outcome and does these things always by what is good because that is his heart. In Deuteronomy, where God is the main character, you can't just remove him and his miracles and his authority from the narrative and then judge him. Which is also, by the way, why this can't be used as a parallel to other human wars or claims to acts of terror as being caused by God. Think about it, the exodus from Egypt into the wilderness and then their entry into the land was the biggest display of miraculous signs and wonders done by God that accompanied the command to enter the land. There is no equivalent today. There are no parallels today. We can't repeat that. It's also important that we see what the nations in the promised land were like before passing judgment on God's command to Israel. The people of Canaan were not a weak, oppressed nation being overrun by a genocidal God. They were a wicked people, and their wickedness knew no ends. They even sacrificed their own children. Deuteronomy chapter 12, verse 29 to 31 says this: "The Lord your God will cut off from before you the nations you are about to invade and dispossess. But when you've driven them out and settled in their land, and after they've been destroyed before you, be careful not to be ensnared by inquiring about their gods, saying, 'How do these nations serve their gods?' We will do the same. You must not worship the Lord your God in their way, because in worshipping their gods, they do all kinds of detestable things the Lord hates. They even burn their sons and daughters in the fire as sacrifices to their gods." And interestingly, way back in the beginning, when God first made his covenant promise with Abraham, he spoke about this people group called the Amorites. The Amorites were later to become the Canaanites, their ancestors. And God prophesied their destruction when the sins of the Amorites would have reached its full measure. It's just worth our while quoting that passage in full. You'll find it in Genesis chapter 15. I'm going to read from verse 12. "As the sun was setting, Abraham fell into a deep sleep, and a thick and dreadful darkness came over him. Then the Lord said to him, 'Know for certain that your descendants, Abraham, will be strangers in a country not their own, and they will be enslaved and mistreated 400 years. But I will punish the nation they serve as slaves, and afterwards they will come out with great possessions,'" clearly describing the Exodus. "You, however, will go to your fathers in peace and be buried at a good old age. In the 4th generation, your descendants will come back here, for the sin of the Amorites has not yet reached its full measure." The accusation that God commands infanticide, the devotion of destruction of innocent Canaanite children, is perhaps the accusation that has the most claws and teeth in this whole argument. And we feel it because they're children in a way that is tangibly different from that of the judgment of adults. But we mustn't forget all that we've already said about God knowing the future and God being loving. This is no doubt difficult, but we do not know that the Canaanite children were worse off, if judging by what their life might have looked like. Likewise, there may have been no reasonable alternative to complete destruction. By not doing that, might not the Canaanite children left alive ended up avenging their parents over many, many years with lots of suffering and far greater loss of life? We read the story and we assume that there must have been a better way. And it's also true, of course, to say that no one is really absolutely innocent. The Bible tells us that total justice only really comes at the end of time, and that, but for the grace of God, we will all face that. But, and this is crucial to see, the Canaanites were warned and were able to repent. It's striking that at the beginning of the book of Joshua in chapter 2, we meet Rahab. Rahab was a Canaanite who said to the 2 spies that came from Israel these words: "I know that the Lord has given this land to you, and that a great fear of you has fallen on us, so that all who live in this country are melting in fear because of you. We've heard how the Lord dried up the water of the Red Sea for you when you came out of Egypt, and what you did to Sihon and Og, the 2 kings of the Amorites, east of the Jordan." Rahab herself and all the people around her have heard. They have seen the evidence as to what God is doing. And if Rahab has seen enough evidence to work out who God is and to respond to him as she says she has, then everyone else has too. They all, the nation, could have come to the same conclusion as Rahab. And likewise, a bit later on in chapter 5, verse 1, we're told that on crossing the Jordan and entering the land, all the Amorite kings west of the Jordan and all the Canaanite kings along the coast heard how the Lord had dried up the Jordan before the Israelites until we'd crossed over. Their hearts melted and they no longer had the courage to face the Israelites. But those kings who heard that didn't follow in Rahab's footsteps. They shut their gates. They chose to fight. The Canaanites had heard, had the opportunity, and were able to repent. They were warned, but they, for the most part, chose not to. And it's worth just saying, therefore, as I close, that it is wrong and totally inappropriate, as we've mentioned earlier, for anyone to use these passages, whether in Deuteronomy or Joshua or elsewhere, as a justification for any acts of violence. Why? Well, the circumstances, the occasion and the people are very specific, and they are of their time. Israel, in the narrative, is acting as God's representative, as his justice bringer to the nations, if you like, who have been opposed to God and in the most awful ways for generations. And so God acts in justice. In fact, very often the battles are described as the Lord acting in judgment on the Canaanites, not Israel. There is no modern equivalent to Israel. In fact, the only equivalent is the judgment to which all of these actions point. When God has and will judge all rebellion against him, either by having judged his Son for it, paying the price for everyone who puts their trust in that payment, or by judging each individual who hasn't repented at the end of time. And so for anyone to see themselves in the role of God's representative in the world would also need for them to replicate everything else in the narrative, the great miracles that accompanied and ratified and gave evidence to what was really going on. But we can't. And so we are left in the hands of a loving, powerful, merciful, and yet just God. So these are tricky questions. They require tricky answers, and hopefully that gives you something to chew on.